have our final response paper given by Brian J. Griffith, an assistant professor of modern European history at California State University, Fresno. He writes and teaches courses on the political and cultural history of Italian fascism, food and beverage history, the history of transnationalism, and digital and public history. He has worked on national identity in Mussolini's Italy, the history of transnational volunteerism during the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, and the Spanish Civil War, and the history of neo-fascism in Italy between the 1950s and the 2010s.
I'm going to try something rather unorthodox and balance, however precariously, this microphone. Are you guys able to hear me? Okay, I tend to speak rather loudly anyways, so hopefully it won't matter. Yeah, I'd like to begin by echoing my colleagues' thanks to the conference organizers and also our hosts at Sapienza and the American Academy for making this conference possible, which I think is not only important historiographically for our literature, for our field, but also really important and rather urgent. Okay, then I'll have to hold it. All right, I'll just do this the traditional way then. A conference that I think is really important not only to the literature and the future of the field in terms of academic knowledge production, but in terms of the wider picture, rather urgent, right, that scholars such as ourselves come together and have these debates, since we are living through what we might consider to be a kind of new wave, right, of fascism. In 1932, 10 years after taking power as prime minister of Italy. Do you mind if I take that for I can change my my slides? Thank you. Yeah, I think I'll have to hold it very high. All right. 10 years after taking power as prime minister of Italy, and 7 years since his declaration of dictatorship in Italy's Chamber of Deputies, Benito Mussolini and the fascist philosopher Giovanni Gentile penned a working definition for Italian fascism, which included its purported intellectual influences, its ideological viewpoints, and its socio-political objectives as they were understood in the early 1930s. Oh, wait, did I go too far? Very good. Published in the Italian Encyclopedia, the political and social doctrine of fascism serves as an important historical benchmark for grappling with what fascism in its original interwar Italian incarnation was, and to a limited extent, continues to be today in its various global expressions. And yet rivers of proverbial ink have been spilled by scholars during the 82 years since the publication of Mussolini and Gentile's essay towards the identification of a quote-unquote generic definition or description for this third-way ideology, with very little agreement among scholars regarding the ideology's fundamental impulses, expressions, and praxis. What explains this lack of consensus among scholars regarding fascism's key features? And what solutions, in terms of scholarly approaches and methodologies, might be awaiting our adoption towards a more productive and potentially unified community of scholarship? In this presentation, I will both provide a general overview of the various historiographical debates and turns in fascist studies, roughly from the 1960s through the 1990s, and offer some cursory observations and suggestions for potential methodological innovations regarding the elucidation of what Ernst Nolte famously dubbed as the fascist minimum moving forward. In seeking to resolve the stagnation which has occurred with respect to the question of generic fascism, I contend that a combination of methodological approaches of visual studies, transnational history, and digital history may very well prove useful in our field's mission of nailing down an empirically grounded, more universally applicable description of what fascism is and, by extension, is not. Doing so is all the more urgent, I would strongly suggest, given the proliferation of fascistic movements and political leaders all across the Western world and beyond in recent years. Quote, if we cannot examine fascism synthetically, as Robert Paxton has aptly observed in his 1998 study, The 5 Stages of Fascism, noting the importance of returning to the question of universal fascism, quote, we risk being unable to understand this century or the next. In the decades following the Second World War, historians of modern Europe began examining the origins and outcomes of various fascist movements, and only in a few cases, dictatorships, seeking to better understand the underlying qualities for what some insisted was a kind of generic or universal fascism linking all of these movements and governments together. While some scholars took fascist politics and culture seriously from the beginning, such as Renzo De Felice, among others, The majority of what I will refer to here as the first wave of fascist studies of interwar European fascisms largely disregarded these ideological communities as little more than totalitarian bulwarks against the spread of Bolshevism, or to quote the 20th century Italian philosopher Benedetto Croce, a temporary quote-unquote parenthesis in an otherwise enlightened or normal historical trajectory. By the late 1960s and onwards into the following decade, however, scholars of ultranationalist populisms had begun to overcome these largely self-imposed analytical obstacles by exploring these interwar movements and dictatorships as novel socio-political projects in their own right, intimately bound up with the tensions and antagonisms of industrial modernity, as opposed to Sonderwegs in an otherwise typical path to social, political, and economic modernization. Among the earliest contributors to the critical study of European fascisms in this fashion, was the German historian and philosopher Ernst Nolte. In his 1966 monograph, The Three Faces of Fascism, Nolte explored the histories of three early European fascist movements and/or regimes: the Action Française in France, Benito Mussolini's Fasci Italiani di Combattimento movement in Italy, and the National Socialists in Germany. In comparing the doctrinal systems of these three ultranationalist movements in post-World War I Europe, Nolte developed what he referred to as a fascist minimum, or the constellation of ideological viewpoints, socio-political values, and collective practices shared between these three ultranationalist communities. Quote, "Fascism," Nolte writes, is somewhat vaguely outlining his definition of universal fascism, quote, "is an anti-Marxism which seeks to destroy the enemy by the evolvement of a radically opposed and yet related ideology, and by the use of almost identical and yet typically modified methods, always, however, within the unyielding framework of national self-assertion and autonomy," end quote. Although Nolte rightly identifies anti-Marxism as among the motivations for the various movements and/or dictatorships loosely labeled as fascist, in particular the Third Reich, whose anti-Bolshevism served as just as much of a motivation for ultranationalist purificatory violence in interwar Germany as anti-Semitism did, the remainder of his observations here lack a certain clarity and intended meaning. Nolte, however, was not alone in his quest for identifying a fascist minimum. In his 1979 essay, published in this monograph here, Toward a General Theory of Fascism, George L. Mosse explored not only the various continuities between fascism, generically conceived, and developments from the 18th and 19th centuries, thereby establishing fascism as an emergent byproduct of Western modernity, but also the ideas and values, worldviews, and objectives shared in common between Mussolini's and Adolf Hitler's respective dictatorships. Intended to outline, however, cursorily the quote-unquote building blocks for a general theory of fascism, Mosse's study encouraged other scholars of fascism to abandon the doctrinal approach to exploring the history of fascism and instead examine the phenomenon as a kind of quote-unquote attitude toward life, end quote, based upon a quote national mystique, which might vary from nation to nation, end quote. Although not quite a fascist minimum, as had been the case with Nolte's monograph, Mosse's building blocks approach helped both to close the proverbial door on fascism as an aberration and open up a new analytical and methodological pathway for subsequent scholarship to follow. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, however, a new wave of scholarly interest in the quest for a fascist minimum began emerging, influenced this time largely by the cultural turn. If we can change the slide one more time. Roger Griffin's 1991 monograph, The Nature of Fascism, for instance, serves as one of the earliest and lastingly influential contributions to the scholarly resuscitation of generic fascism. In broadening the field's focus beyond just the question of comparing fascist Italy to Nazi Germany, and inevitably arriving at the contrasting differences which had flummoxed previous generations of historians, Griffin proposes a description for universal fascism which is centered around the quote-unquote myth of national rebirth. We do that again. Thank you. Fascism, Griffin succinctly maintains, quote, is a genus of political ideology whose mythic core in its various permutations is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism, end quote. Unified by a shared anxiety regarding the perception of national decadence or decline, and dedicated to deploying forms of purificatory violence towards the healing of the national community from its various externally and internally inflicted wounds, Griffith contends. The, quote, mythic core, end quote, of fascism is predicated upon a vision of national restoration via a totalitarian sociopolitical system. This mythic core, furthermore, is expressed, quote, not only in theoretical writings, speeches, and propaganda, but also in the semiotic language of rallies, symbols, and uniforms, which is to say, quote, the whole style of its politics, end quote. Such an approach, Griffith contends, is flexible enough to account for specific national idiosyncrasies, such as the charismatic leader cult or the obsession with notions of genetic or racial health, while simultaneously anticipating the, quote, extensive ideological heterogeneity which exists between various manifestations, both within and beyond interwar Europe. Indeed, generic fascism is definable in Griffith's eyes precisely, quote, in terms of a cluster of values and goals, common to all its various permutations, end quote, rather than any one specific attitude, viewpoint, or policy. In responding to these debates with respect to generic fascism, Robert O. Paxton outlines a dynamic or multi-staged approach for outlining fascism's universally applicable qualities, tendencies, and objectives. Thank you. In his 1998 Journal of Modern History study, The 5 Stages of Fascism, likely an intentional allusion to the title of Nolte's foundational 1966 study, Paxton proposes a collection of historical strategies for interpreting fascistic movements and governments across both time and space. Since the, quote, words of fascist intellectuals correspond only distantly with what fascist movements do after they have power, end quote, Paxton correctly observes, scholars ought to examine the choices made by fascists in their daily actions, as opposed to getting bogged down in the contradictions that obscure every reading of fascist texts. To develop a generic description or universal model, scholars must analyze fascism in its daily operation or in motion, Paxton contends, quote, through its cycle of potential, though not inevitable stages, end quote. In total, Paxton proposes 5 stages of socio-political development for fascist movements. The first, or the initial, stage is the establishment of the movements themselves, while the second is their rooting as parties in a political system. The acquisition of power and the exercise of power, both of which, it should be noted, frequently take on contrastingly different forms and expressions depending upon the national context, are Paxton's 3rd and 4th stages of fascism's development. Fascism's 5th and final stage is radicalization or entropy, during which fascist regimes either accelerate towards full radicalization, as did Nazi Germany in the lead up to and especially during World War II, or they devolve, like fascist Italy did, into what Paxton refers to as a quote-unquote routine authoritarianism. By the early 2000s, this second wave of scholarly enthusiasm for studying generic fascism had once again begun fizzling into historiographical obscurity. However, as scholarly interest in the question of universal fascism was waning, new historiographical turns began appearing on the horizon, which, I'm contending in this presentation, offer fascist studies opportunities for pushing the boundaries of our knowledge of fascisms beyond 20th century Europe, and equally as significant, pushing forward on identifying some form of a fascist minimum with, in contrast to previous proposals, the potential for a scholarly consensus. Thank you. During the last 20 or so years, scholars of fascism have begun widening our analytical lens by comparing the aesthetic strategies of ultranationalist populisms from as far afield as interwar Asia, Africa, and the Americas. And along with these path-breaking studies have come new historical questions and interpretive strategies. If fascism's origins were, contrary to the pronouncements of many first-wave historians of European fascisms, and I'm thinking of Allardyce here in particular, not singularly rooted in the horrors of industrial warfare during the First World War and the tumultuous aftermaths of demobilization and, in some cases, revolution, then what alternative approaches might be necessary for moving beyond these largely Eurocentric models for studying generic fascism, especially on a global scale? These questions and more are explored in Julia Adaney Thomas and Jeff Ely's 2020 anthology, Visualizing Fascism, the 20th Century Rise of the Global Right. Thank you. Based on 2 central themes, fascism as a global and as an aesthetic phenomenon, The studies in visualizing fascism propose to, quote-unquote, see fascism generically, according to the consistencies between different far-right aesthetic strategies across time and space, as opposed to what their followers believed, wrote down, or the idiosyncratic objectives they pursued. In departing from history's traditional emphasis upon the scholarly consultation of text-based archival materials, the essays in visualizing fascism investigate the ways in which extreme right-wing movements and governments in Europe, Africa, and parts of Asia deployed photography, graphic design, motion pictures, architecture, and monuments, among other topics and themes, as a common visual vocabulary for communicating with and as well as nationalizing and militarizing the masses within their respective contexts. In the anthology's introduction, Thomas articulates the theoretical framework for what she has aptly dubbed a quote-unquote portable definition of fascism, which travels across space and time and is useful in analyzing places where fascist movements failed, as well as places where fascist regimes were established. This portable definition of universal fascism, Thomas explains, is based upon 5 interrelated propositions. Thank you. Firstly, quote, fascism cannot be safely consigned to the past, end quote, and can therefore recur, quote, whenever people become alienated not only from the traditional right, but also from liberal democratic and left-wing alternatives, end quote. Fascism is the product of a political crisis in modern capitalist states, Thomas's second foundational principle contends, widening our analytical framework for thinking about the socio-political contexts of what might be referred to as a fascist impulse. Less dependent upon the collective traumas of industrial-scale warfare, Thomas's second principle encourages scholars to investigate the categorical contexts in which fascist movements have historically developed, including, but by no means limited to, incidents involving a perceived national humiliation, such as a major defeat on the battlefield, as was the case with Germany after 1918, the so-called mutilated victory of the First World War, which was Italy's case the following year, or in their homeland's prolonged entanglement with foreign imperial powers, which had been the case with China in the 1920s and 30s. And here I'm thinking of the blue shirts, a small fascist movement in 1920s, 30s China, as opposed to specific and nationally dependent events or processes which have not only contributed to and reinforced, which have only contributed to and reinforced scholarly disagreement with respect to the question of generic fascism. Thomas's third and fourth propositions contend that violence was oftentimes viewed by fascists as, quote, key to propelling the dissolution of civility and governability, end quote, which is more often than not pursued via the irrational appeal to popular emotions. The fifth and final proposition brings readers closer to the anthology's historiographical contributions. Quote, visual presentations of fascist ideology were crucial precisely because the message of the graphic arts, images, collages, movies, monuments, and pageantry was elusive and emotive, end quote. In distancing ourselves from the trappings of textual sources, which continuously point our scholarship back to specific regional and or nationalist contexts, the further study of palingenesis-oriented ultra-nationalist visual cultures, I am suggesting here, could very well help scholars of fascism better elucidate the underlying principles of what might be referred to as a common visual vocabulary between these seemingly disparate movements and governments. Beyond these examinations of far-right aesthetics, a growing number of scholars have begun moving beyond geopolitical boundaries by exploring fascism from a paradoxically enough transnational methodological perspective. Intended to problematize the nation-state complex as both a historically lived reality and, more pertinent for our purposes, a historiographical concept, transnationalism, in the words of Angel Alcalde, quote, focuses on transfers between countries and nations and cross-border exchanges and circulation of people and ideas, thereby exposing the interconnectedness of modern, globalized society. Transnational history, I should say, quote, transnational history allows us to reflect on, while at the same time going beyond the confines of the nation, end quote, Patricia Clavin elaborates, adding that the cross-border macro-scale methodology, quote, sheds new comparative light on the strengths and the fragilities of the nation-state and underlines the ways in which local history can be understood in relation to broader forces in modern world history, end quote. Transnational history, however, should not be considered just a mere extension of a previous field, international history. Indeed, while the latter analyzes nation-states and nationalisms within their respective contexts, the former examines their porosity and their permeability, highlighting the networks of individuals, groups, and movements which crisscross between their respective borders, and shining a light on the significant contributions of multinational currents and influences in the quote-unquote making of nationalisms and nation-states, as well as in the making of social, cultural, political and economic connectivities between the confines, or beyond the confines of national communities. This particular approach not only contributes to the provincialization of interwar European fascisms within the wider context of pursuing a more globally representative fascist minimum, which Thomas's and Ely's visualizing fascism anthology attempted to accomplish through visual studies, but it holds the potential for being combined with other analytical tools and approaches, including those associated with digital history, which I will be elaborating on here in the following section. In their 2016 monograph, Transnational Fascism in the 20th Century, Spain, Italy, and the Global Neo-Fascist Network, Matteo Albanese and Pablo Del Hierro explore the history of the global neo-fascist network which existed during the 1920s and the late Cold War years. Adopting a historical network approach, the co-authors examine the transnational connections not only between Spanish and Italian fascist circles, but also between the Southern European, I'm going to use the word nodes, that'll become important in the next section, to reference the methodological vocabulary of social network analysis, and various individuals and organizations in North and South America. In doing so, Albanese and Hierro show, quote, how this network became a crucial channel for communication, exchange of ideas, and even cooperation within the neo-fascist political field, end quote. One of the more glaring implications of applying a transnational methodological framework to studying fascism, of course, has to do with the ideology's nationalist foundations. While the vast majority of studies on the history of fascism rightly characterize the ideology's various manifestations as ultra-nationalist, the co-authors of Transnational Fascism in the 20th Century, building upon the insights of Andrea Mammone, contend that fascism, quote, cannot be fully understood without the transnational dimension, end quote. Indeed, by abandoning our adherence to historically established geopolitical boundaries within our respective studies, scholars can avoid falling victim to the, quote, exceptionalist parochialism, which so often characterizes the single country focus in fascist studies, while simultaneously avoiding the opposite trap of excessively general conceptual models, end quote. In pushing our perspectives beyond the exclusionary boundaries of nation-states, therefore, scholars of fascism might be able to better pinpoint the areas of ideological and programmatic overlap which brought these disparate movements and dictatorships together into collaboration, however loosely and informally, and thereby better identify the universal ideological impulses and values shared between them. Lastly, let's turn briefly to the question of generic fascism and digital history. In the last 30 or so years, historians and scholars from various other humanities and social sciences disciplines have developed a whole suite of digital software and, with them, methodologies designed to help researchers identify macro-level associations, patterns, and connections within their respective subjects, which, due to the sheer scale of the information involved, would take years, if not decades, to sift through and comprehend in a systematic fashion, by individual researchers. Among the software and interpretive approaches worth mentioning here are text mining, topic modeling, and most importantly, social network analysis, which I'll abbreviate here as SNA. So due to my time constraints in this presentation, if you'd like to read the longer paper that's available, I do elaborate on text mining and topic modeling, but I'll be focusing exclusively on SNA in the following pages. At its core, SNA is based upon two categories of visually representable data, nodes and edges. Nodes, for our purposes, might be the individuals, groups, or ideas under examination, while the edges might be the relationships between these individuals, groups, or ideas. One of the strengths of SNA is its flexibility or its scalability. Using an SNA approach, Researchers can develop small-scale models of historical networks representing the relationships between small groups of individuals, or large-scale models featuring hundreds, and in some cases, thousands of different individuals, groups, and their overlapping movements and governments. By visualizing these nodes and edges via software such as Gephi, which is the one that you see on the following, if you can change the slide, here we are, this is Gephi here. Gephi, Cytoscape, and the impossibly Byzantine software R. If you know anything about that, you know what I'm talking about. To name just a few of these, scholars can better identify the dominant individuals, groups, and organizations, as well as values, ideas, and objectives within the historical network under examination. By exploring, or rather incorporating, these types of approaches, scholars of fascism on both individual and collaborative scales might consider developing a large-scale open-access database, or better yet, a series of interconnected databases featuring the most widely used words and phrases for individual movements and dictatorships, the associations between those topics and various other topics in the database, and in terms of visualizing fascisms in transnational perspective, the strongest as well as the weakest nodes and edges in the historical networks connecting these groups to a mythic core of shared concepts and practices. In developing an open access model of ultra-right-wing individuals, networks, and their ideas and values in these ways, and explicitly drawing upon the methodological approaches and historiographical insights of the previously discussed fields of visual studies and transnational history, I contend, historians might be able to lay the discursive foundations for a more globally representative, and therefore potentially more widely acceptable, description of generic fascism. Conclusion, thank you. All right, so in conclusion, in the last 30 or so years, scholars of fascism have laid the methodological groundwork for the quote-unquote rebirth, if you will, of the scholarly pursuit of a working definition for generic or universal fascism. Increasingly unmoored from the Eurocentrism of first-wave scholarship and the conceptual limitations of the nation-state complex, historians of palingenetic ultranationalist populisms have developed a handful of interpretive approaches which, when combined, might serve as a platform for empirically connecting the classical far-right dictatorships in Europe with revolutionary ultranationalist movements and governments from as far afield as East Asia, Africa, and the Americas. As Roger Griffin has pointed out, fascism, generically speaking, is describable not in terms of a simple or stagnant collection of ideological ingredients, ranging from the authoritarian leader cult of interwar Europe's classical dictatorships, or to the militarization of society and politics, but rather in terms of a cluster of values and goals common to all the various permutations. These clusters, as I have suggested, could very well be studied and measured via a digital history approach, utilizing the computing power of text mining, topic modeling, and most importantly for its applicability with transnational history, social network analysis. By building up an open access database featuring the central ideas and stated objectives of various fascistic movements and governments, scholars would be able to closely examine the strongest nodes in this network connecting each of these far-right communities together, and thereby develop an empirically grounded collection of clusters of what might be labeled as generic fascist values and goals. Such a digital history approach, moreover, might also be well suited to taking Robert Paxton's observations regarding fascism's stages of development more seriously. As Paxton and others have pointed out, not all fascisms evolved from the initial stage of movement to a single-party rule, as Mussolini's and Hitler's regimes did. And given that fascism, at least in its Italian expression, tended historically to adjust its program in accordance with the available stepping stones of political opportunism, thereby changing their values and goals along the way. Such an open access database would naturally require and be capable of doing or implementing a temporally sensitive dimensionality in order to more accurately measure the commonalities shared between different fascisms across space, and most importantly for these purposes, time, that is, with respect to these stages of development. Perhaps there are still yet to be made observations about the ways in which fascists pursued power, either successfully or unsuccessfully, waiting for historians in such a digital history-aided research program. And yet, one might be left to wonder why really any of this matters. Why would historians want to develop a generic conception or description of fascism anyway? What advantage beyond the realm of scholarly curiosity and academic knowledge production does such a globally collaborative project offer? Since fascism, as we know, was not swept into the proverbial dustbin of history following the collapse of the Axis alliance in the Second World War, but rather was reborn via the various neo-fascist movements and political parties of the post-war years. Such an open access research database system might also help scholars better elucidate the historical connections between classical fascisms and those of the Cold War and subsequent periods. Doing so, I argue, is not only necessary for expanding our knowledge of what fascism was and, to a great extent, continues to be, but will also be an extremely useful resource in spotting fascistic movements as they form and thereby combating the spread of fascism within our contemporary societies. Quote, "It is not enough to treat each national case individually, as if each one constitutes a category in itself," Paxton has correctly observed, adding that if historians are not able to develop a synthetic model for generic fascism, thereby paving the way for thinking more critically and widely about the potential forms fascism might take moving forward, quote, "we risk being unable to understand this century or the next," end quote. And if we would like to both better understand the history of fascisms during the long 20th century and simultaneously enjoy the next 80 years of a global community largely free from the scourge of fascistic political cultures, then we must forge ahead on the path leading towards a universally applicable description of fascism. Now, I say grazie for your attention.